Good evening, everyone. This is my paper on restorative justice entitled, Should We Just Lock 'Em All Up and Throw Away the Keys and Turn Out the Lights? In this paper, I will show that the present Canadian criminal justice system is inefficient and unethical in its overall approach to justice, and why it needs to be revisited for the benefit of society, victims, and the criminals, with consideration of the glory of God. As we have seen with my last paper on in vitro fertilization, I illustrated that science ought to be safely buckled in the back seat of the car while God is in control of the wheel of conception. This topic uses a somewhat different approach, but same illustration. The government has been instituted by God, as we see in Romans chapter 13, verse 1 to 7, where verse 1 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 and 14, it says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good." Since the government has been instituted by God, we know as Christians the role of government is to administer justice, and that is why I see the role of government more in the shotgun position, in the passenger seat, next to and in subjection to God, as they deal out justice in a God-glorifying and equitable manner to the citizens of a particular nation. In this case, Canada. From a Christian perspective, I will argue that criminals, victims, and society deserve a fair and just distribution of justice for the crime or harm perpetrated. The Canadian criminal system is firstly inefficient, and secondly unethical, because the Canadian criminal justice system violates the basic freedom of the criminals, violates the basic freedom of the victims, violates the basic freedom of society, and violates God's specific purpose for government and the freedom He bestows upon civilization and her ruling authorities. How do we fix a broken Canadian criminal system? The answer is restorative justice. But what is restorative justice? Well, there are many names in which it is given, such as reparative justice, but it basically means making amends or bringing back to a proper standing. In this case, it means bringing the offender, in a system of criminal justice, to some state of rehabilitation, and the victim back together in a form of reconciliation. Restorative justice focuses on the victims, offenders, and the community. This is in contrast to the present Canadian criminal system, which distributes justice from a federal perspective, not taking into consideration the specific needs of the parties involved, and in a general sense has a tough-on-crime attitude with little care for the criminal or community. According to John Brathwaite, restorative justice is, quote, "a process where all stakeholders affected by an injustice have an opportunity to discuss how they have been affected by the injustice and to decide what should be done to repair the harm." With crime, restorative justice is about the idea that because crime hurts, justice should heal. It follows that conversations with those who have been hurt and with those who have inflicted the harm must be central to the process. End quote. Restorative justice has been around since crime has had a name. We can find examples of restorative justice in Exodus chapter 22 verse 1 to 4, where in God's law a thief was to pay at least twice as much as he had stolen. This is restitution. Do not get me wrong. I am not trying to introduce what is known as theonomy or Christian Reconstructionism into Canadian society, which states that God's law is for today. On the contrary, because there are other examples throughout history where nations have practiced this tried and tested, efficient and ethical means of justice, and they have had little to no regard for God's law. In 2060 BC, in Sumer, which is present-day Iraq, in 1700 BC in Babylon, in 449 BC in Rome, and also in more familiar times, Ireland, Germany, and England have all used some sort of restorative justice for property crimes and for non-violent and violent offenses against others. Restorative justice works. We just need a good enough reason to implement this method of criminal justice in Canada. That brings me to my first argument, and that is Canada's present criminal justice system is not efficient. Canada's criminal system may not be broken in pieces, but it surely is hanging on by the thinnest of threads. We need to do something about it, and we need to do something about it quickly. There is a group in Canada known as ARPA, Association for Reform Political Action, who sees our present criminal system as hanging by that very thread, which is why on May 6th they will be sending a speaker to Ottawa to address members of Parliament on this very topic. The Canadian criminal system is inadequate, to say the least, and its only hope is change and reform to a system of restorative justice. Why do I say that the Canadian's criminal system is basically broken? Well, there are many reasons, but we will look at a few of them here. The Canadian criminal system is basically broken because criminals, victims, and society and our resources are not being used as efficiently as possible. There is no doubt that every system has waste, fraud, and abuse. We are a fallen people, and we will not see perfection this side of heaven, but that does not mean we should not aim at change and reform when we see inefficiencies. The purpose of criminal justice ought to be to rehabilitate the offender and reconcile the victim and bring society to a state of normalcy. We do not do that in Canada. Generally, we look at ways of cleaning up the streets and getting tough on crime. When it comes to criminals, they are either handled by the federal government or by provincial or territorial governments. The federal government has jurisdiction over all adults over the age of 18 who are serving 2 years or more, as well as adults on parole or on a statutory release. Provincial and territorial governments have jurisdiction over all adults 18 years of age who are serving 2 years or less for a crime, and those persons that are remanded for trial, sentencing, and those on community sentences such as probation. Stats Canada shows in 2011 that the incarceration rate, that is, those who are in either the federal, provincial, or territorial prison, has increased. Not to mention the remand rate, those waiting for trial or sentencing, has also increased, which means that the government needs more resources to pay for things like prisons, guards, administration, lawyers, and police officers. And apparently, what they have been doing has not been working, despite pumping billions of dollars into the system. Crime may not be shocking as you read the local news or you turn on your television, but what is shocking is the report by CBC last November that showed that there has been a 75% increase of visible minorities into the prison system over the past decade. Other visible minorities include Aboriginals, blacks, and those that come over from other countries. But are these visible minorities worse criminals than white people? I think not. It is a problem with the system. Some reports suggest that crime has decreased, but the number of people in cells do not lie. 10 years ago, there were 12,000 federal inmates, but now there are over 15,000. Howard Sapers, who was a correctional investigator, spoke in a church in Toronto and said that in regards to the federal correctional policy, quote, "You cannot reasonably claim to have a just society with incarceration rates like these," end quote. He told the congregation or the audience that was listening there that 25% of the inmates are Aboriginals, even though Aboriginals only make up 8% of the population, and that Aboriginal women have increased by 80% over the past 10 years. Over the past 5 years, the federal budget for the Correctional Service of Canada, or the CSC, has increased 40% to a whopping $2.6 billion. If you were to track where the money is going, you will find that the government is building 2,700 new prison cells for expected inmates because of their tough on crime initiatives. Sapers said that the problems in the past arose because of stress within the prison system, and that many of those problems are still a major problem today, such as crowding, too much time in cells, lack of contact with the outside world, lack of program capacity, the paucity of meaningful prison work and vocational skills training, and polarization between inmates and custodial staff. On top of regular prison expenses, many prisons are hampered with sick and elderly patients, which cost the system $210 million last year alone. Finally, he noted that our present government's new policies on crime have made it, quote, more difficult to rehabilitate and reintegrate prisoners into society as contributing members. If the inefficiency is not overtly apparent, the report stated that there has been a 23% increase in spending on the correction system over the past 10 years. And even though it only costs half as much to incarcerate women than it does men, the cost to keep one man in prison for 1 year is a staggering $110,000. As he mentioned, crime rates are actually down, but the problem is with government policy, and Prime Minister Stephen Harper's government's stance with tough on crime, which includes mandatory minimums, is our biggest problem. In Texas, there is a group called Right on Crime. They have the much needed support of the governor of Texas and they have been able to save billions of dollars by changing and reforming their prison system. They hope to be a model for other states to follow suit. They actually did so well that they closed a prison and have stopped the plans of building additional prisons. One gentleman said, quote, "If we can do it in Texas, we can do it anywhere," end quote. Their approach is not called restorative justice per se, but they have been looking at the ways they have been treating criminals and reprioritizing the needs of the victims, communities, and the offenders. They have realized that many of their approaches, which were the direct result of the Obama administration's tough on crime stance, were unethical. That brings me to my second argument, and that is Canada's present criminal justice system is not ethical. As I have stated, the Canadian criminal system is hanging by the thinnest of threads, if not a bubble ready to burst, due to its inefficiencies. But more troubling than the burden of taxes on a society are the ethical considerations. We in Canada are blessed to live in a free, democratic society. She is far from perfect, but she is home to nearly 35 million people. Our freedoms are based on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that says, quote, Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. End quote. What we cannot do is redefine who God is and change the rules of the law. One initial problem is that offenders are thrown into prisons for breaking laws that should not have prison sentences attached. When it comes to offenses in Canada, 76% of them are non-violent, such as property offenses, impaired driving, drunk offenses, and even though the other 24% was of a violent nature, we can see that keeping 76% of the offenders locked up in federal, provincial, and territorial prisons is unethical, because they are not all treated according to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in that 1, they are oftentimes not tried within a reasonable time, which again is inefficient, but also unethical because the accused is tied up in the system until sentencing is issued, and 2, they are not entirely ever acquitted of an offense because it is as though their punishment is a life sentence, even if they are re-entered into society, because they are labeled as if wearing a scarlet letter. And 3, with so many minorities being incarcerated, there is an injustice as to the treatment of the individual according to race. Additionally, the Bible tells us that we ought to treat crime swiftly, as in Ecclesiastes 8:11, and in an equitable fashion, as in Exodus 22:1-4. Justice must be prompt and fair. Besides the unethical treatment of nonviolent offenders by locking them up unnecessarily, we also see that after the flood, Noah was given the command of, quote, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image, end quote. This means that execution is ethical, and when a society like Canada abolishes capital punishment, as it did in the 1960s, what we have is the caging of violent criminals for decades, and they are treated as if they were not made in the image of God, but were of a lower class, to be treated as an animal, when God said to execute the murderer. This is a just and right sentence for the man who sheds blood. Do any of you recollect the case in Canada involving Travis Baumgartner? He was the young armored car guard who shot and killed 3 of his fellow co-workers. He shot a 4th who did not die. He wanted to pay off his debts, so he planned to kill his co-workers and steal the cash. He was caught and sentenced in what was dubbed the harshest sentence since the last execution by hanging in 1962. Baumgartner was given life, which is 25 years in Canada, with no chance of parole for 40 years. Yes, it is a long time, but do you know what the family said? A brother of one of the victims said, quote, it's the system. You call it justice? Sure, justice. But my way of justice is back in the old days. You hang 'em. That's justice for what he did, end quote. Another victim's aunt said, quote, I'm not sure when you are going through this level of pain if you can ever feel satisfied with the justice that is available. but I do believe they worked very hard for us, and I think we're grateful. And I think that we've been honored today. They knew that justice was not satisfied. Even though Canada's criminal system is broken, objections arise. But these objections are not based on the basic idea of restorative justice, but rather on the practicality and implementation. Advocates of the present criminal system suggest that restorative justice, quote, erodes legal rights, that it results in net widening, that restorative justice trivializes crime, particularly men's violence against women. Restorative justice fails to restore victims and offenders. Restorative justice fails to effect real change and to prevent recidivism. Restorative justice results in discriminatory outcomes. Restorative justice extends police powers. Restorative justice leaves power imbalances untouched. Restorative justice leads to vigilantism. Restorative justice lacks legitimacy, and restorative justice fails to provide justice. Now, these are legitimate concerns, but again, as they would say, it's not so much the idea, but it's the practicality. But restorative justice is a tried and tested, efficient and ethical means of criminal justice, with the aim of rehabilitation and reconciliation, rather than just locking people up and throwing away the key. Ethically speaking, from a deontological ethic, someone might say that we ought to lock them up and throw away the key because the law says so. But seeing that the law changes, we cannot ride that horse to the finish line. A utilitarian might say that the system we have is not perfect, but it is useful and relatively practical, so we should stick to it. But since I have shown that the present Canadian criminal system is not working properly, then all we are left with is beating that horse to death before it makes it back to the barn. That leaves us with the question of what are we to do, or how can restorative justice be implemented into the present Canadian criminal system? Or what are some practical applications of restorative justice? As I just mentioned, with the difference that comes with nonviolent and violent crimes, we have to start there. In no way do I mean to belittle prisoners, but I see it as a good haircut. We have to fade out the back, trim the top, and taper the sides. Fading out the back is the reform of the criminal system that places non-violent criminals in prison. That needs to be faded out. The trim off the top is the reintroduction of capital punishment into the Canadian criminal system. We need to execute those murderers that have been found guilty in a fair and just trial. Finally, we need to taper the sides by finding the most efficient and ethical ways of dealing with prisoners who are a serious threat to society. As it has been said, quote, prison is a place for people we are scared of, not for people who we are mad at, end quote. Throughout this process, restorative justice is the way in which lasting change will take place. This takes place within the prison, as we provide focus groups, education, and other means that will provide the inmate with hope and tools necessary for the reintegration into society. Do you remember a man, Bernard Kerik, the New York City Police Commissioner who served jail time? Upon release, he made it his mission to change and reform prisons in America, as he has had the opportunity to experience both sides of the bars. And he is the one who realized that the American criminal system is broken. but he offers various suggestions that will help the offender, victims, and society. And those suggestions are, for the offender, home confinement, house arrest, probation, drug courts, boot camps, dismissed convictions, and school programs. Those in themselves will help the offender, but in return will help the victim and the community, because you will have a tax-paying citizen who is able to take care of their own family. In this essay, I have shown that the Canadian criminal justice system is broken and in need of repair due to the inefficiencies and unethical manner in which it is operating. From a Christian perspective, I have argued that criminals, victims, and society have a freedom based on our Charter of Rights and Freedoms to a basic standard of living, and that although the government is in a powerful position to administer justice, they must always remember that it is God who is calling the shots. Nowadays, with budget cuts on key sectors in Canadian society, we as Canadians ought to pay attention and react to any inefficiencies and unethical practices, because if they do not affect us directly in one way or another, the Canadian criminal system will have an impact on our lives. We can all partake in the direction of our criminal system, and we can all participate in some aspect of restorative justice. Remember, closure does not just end when the cell door closes. That is just the beginning of a new life towards rehabilitation and reconciliation. Ultimately, we must remember, when it comes to justice, God will have the final say on Judgment Day. Whether a criminal has slipped through the system or has paid his debts to society, the reality is that if your sin has not been paid in full by Jesus Christ, then no amount of time and punishment on earth will pay for God's eternal punishment. Be ye reconciled to God. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation on restorative justice.